In this story, I'm going to tell you how I found out my husband had been siphoning our money, rewriting our history to make me look unstable, and quietly turning family opinion against me. But I didn't explode or lash out. I built a calm, ruthless paper trail: receipts, altered calendars, texts, and baited a family meeting where one small, private keepsake became the concrete proof that unspooled his lies. Watch and I'll show you, step by step, how intimacy became the evidence that reclaimed my home, my reputation, and my future. My name is Evelyn Hart. I am 34, and I live in Portland, Oregon. For 8 years, my life orbited around Jonah, my husband. He was the person who read the weather with me on slow Sunday mornings, who folded my grandmother's quilts into the cedar chest, who promised we would one day turn the upstairs room into a studio for my watercolor work. We met at a summer arts fair the year I finished college. He convinced me to sell paintings at one booth, and we spent the whole afternoon arguing about whether a stormy sky could be hopeful. We built a lot of small rituals from that. On Thursdays, we ordered pho and watched terrible reality shows. On the first snow, we made coffee and walked to the park with the dog. On birthdays, we read a single paragraph from the same book and drank cheap champagne. We shared a landlord, a bank account, and a plan to buy a rambling house in southeast Portland the next year. I trusted him because of 3 things that felt solid. He had stood by me when my mother's bills spiraled, and we sold old furniture to cover expenses. He handled the small day-to-day things without being asked: the grocery lists, the dentist appointments, the tax forms, and he had told me more than once that our projects were forever, that he wanted our future tied together. Jonah knew my family history. He knew how I cried at funerals. He knew which of my grandmother's recipes made me nostalgic. He joked with my sister, coordinated with our neighbors. And when I was anxious about the mortgage, we made a plan to tighten the budget and meet again in 3 months. I believed him because of the long history, the daily routines that reduced my fear, and the future plan we had sketched on napkins and in late night conversations. For a long time, that trust made betrayal feel impossible. Lately, something had been off. It started as small pauses in his answers when I asked about the credit card bill, or when he closed his laptop at the sound of my key. He still laughed at our old jokes, and he still made the same terrible coffee at 6:30. But there were nights he left the house for an hour and came back smelling faintly of someone else's cologne on his sweater. He would tell me a story about a contractor, while the detail that mattered, the cost I had not agreed to, would be missing. I told myself I was being silly, and that exhaustion rewired perception. Then, one evening after a neighbor's roof work left us without power, Jonah and I sat by candlelight, and I asked him gently about a mortgage reminder that had bounced. He smiled, reached for my hand like a man who had always known me, and said he'd handle it, that everything would be fine. His grip was steady, his promise the old promise, and in my chest I felt the same steady relief I had learned to rely on. Later that week, the bank called. My sister asked why the landlord said we had an overdue notice, and my voice started to get smaller when I said we would sort it out. Something was wrong, but I still could not see the shape of it. The first real crack showed up at the family paperwork meeting for my late grandmother's estate. We gathered in my aunt's living room. Jonah came with me, as he always did when family mattered. And because my aunt expected him, and he had been included on the email chain about the trust. My mother was not well and could not travel, and the more I thought about our future, the more uneven the ledger looked. My name was in the will for a particular quilt, and the small house down the road was supposed to be shared with cousins. At the meeting, Jonah sat at my side. He knew the story of the quilt and the joke about the attic light that never worked. He helped me carry boxes and translate legalese into plain talk, and I felt grateful. During the meeting, I noticed other things happening. A cousin asked about renovations. An uncle asked whether our mortgage had been finalized, and Jonah began answering as if he were a separate actor, telling versions of our finances that did not match my records. When I asked him in front of the family about a wire transfer that appeared on my statement, his face went blank, and then he laughed it off as a mistake, said he had paid a contractor from our joint account because he had promised them earlier. I felt heat rise in my throat because I had not authorized that payment. I pulled out my phone and found a transaction alert that did not line up with the dates he said. I tried to stay calm, to phrase the question without accusing him. He squeezed my knee and said softly that it was just paperwork noise. He had it under control. After the meeting, my aunt cornered me and asked if everything was okay between Jonah and me, because he had been so helpful that day. I lied and said yes. That night at home, we had a quiet, practical argument about money that should have resolved itself with a schedule for reconciliation and a ledger entry. But it did not. Jonah told me he had moved some savings to a contractor's account to keep a project from stalling. He said he had done it because I was stressed, and he did not want me to worry. He used the language of care, of protection. I should have felt reassured. Instead, I felt exposed. I dug through our bank notifications and saw a pattern. Small, unauthorized transfers, unexpected charges on the card we both used, and a closed line of credit I had been paying for details he had access to because of how we lived our life together. I confronted him, and he admitted to making the payments, but framed them as keeping our home intact, as making good on promises he had made to other relatives to smooth things over. He begged me not to tell my mother, not to involve the lawyer, to trust him. His words were the old anchors: history, routine, future plan. But they were being used to paper over choices that affected my housing stability and our financial security. I tried to talk to him about involving our accountant, or at least writing the transfers down. He laughed, then did something I had never seen. He started telling other family members' versions of our fights. He called my sister and described me as stressed, fragile, someone who did not understand the world of contractors. A cousin texted me a screenshot of a message where Jonah said I was being dramatic about numbers. Suddenly, family meetings and shared rituals were bending under the weight of his stories. He was shaping the narrative in private and making me the unreliable one in public. I felt the first real chill of betrayal, the betrayal of a partner who weaponized intimacy and trust to rewrite the ledger and our reputation. I tried to fix it the way we had always fixed things, calmly, with records and conversations. I started documenting everything: bank alerts, the texts he sent to relatives, the calendar invites he altered to hide payments. I moved our bills to autopay under my email notice, made copies of statements, and printed a timeline of transactions to show a clear pattern. Every confrontation with him began with the memory of why I had trusted him. It was easier to keep my voice level if I reminded myself of the long history. At first, he apologized in small ways, saying he had panicked about the contractor or that his cousin had pressured him. He promised to reverse the transfers, to put things on paper, to let our accountant look. For a while, I believed him because it felt like the Jonah I knew: responsible, embarrassed, repentant. But each time I thought we had made progress, he would contradict a detail he previously swore by. He would say a payment happened on a different date, or that the contractor's name on a receipt was a different person. He began claiming I had misread emails. He used tiny inconsistencies in our daily routine: who paid for which groceries, who picked up dry cleaning, as a defense, and then changed his story around our family paperwork to make me doubt my own notes. My mother called to ask if I was managing the bills. I told her we were working through a cobbled mess. My aunt, who had always trusted Jonah when I sounded panicked, said she was surprised he had handled so much and implied he had been a stabilizing force. My sister stopped answering my late-night texts, saying she needed to think. People I once assumed would stand with me started to pull away because Jonah had quietly reshaped their idea of me. The worst blow came when I found a folder in the shared cloud drive with copies of messages Jonah had sent to family members describing me as unstable, scatterbrained, and unsuited to handle finances since the day I had left work to paint full-time. He had been rewriting our private history to excuse the missing money. I felt the house get colder. I could not sleep. Every morning, the dog would nuzzle my hand, and I would lie awake thinking how long he had been preparing this version of the truth. My lowest moment came when the landlord sent a formal notice about missed mortgage assistance filings, and Jonah told the landlord I had handled the paperwork and the mistake was mine. The landlord, who had known both of us for years, looked at me differently. At a family dinner, my uncle quietly asked if maybe we should take a step back from the house purchase. My cousins exchanged looks I had seen before only in films. Suddenly, I was isolated within the family system that had defined me for a decade, and Jonah was at the center of that shift. I could have left. I could have taken a suitcase and the dog and gone to a friend's couch. But the stakes included more than my immediate comfort. The house we intended to buy was tied to my plan to lean into my art, to the reputation I had in my family as someone who cared for my mother's memory, and to the dignity I had earned by being the one who managed complicated family things. Walking away would mean losing all of that, or at least ceding it to the narrative he was building. I decided to use the one weapon he had given me without realizing it: documentation and a timed reveal. I spent weeks organizing receipts, collecting transaction alerts, copying the texts where he had told cousins different stories, and pulling the timeline of calendar changes where payments were rescheduled to cover up transfers. I also quietly spoke with a cousin who had been skeptical of Jonah's tales. She admitted she had felt uneasy about how often he called her to explain our household drama, and that she had kept some of his messages. She had been watching, not loudly, and when I told her what I planned, she agreed to sit with us at the family meeting. I consulted an attorney for guidance on how to present financial discrepancies without making illegal allegations, and to understand how to protect my housing and financial standing. The plan was simple and lawful: gather evidence, call a family meeting, present it calmly and clearly, and then enforce boundaries with consequences we could all live with. I invited my aunt, my skeptical cousin, and the landlord to the meeting, and I asked Jonah to come because this was our family matter. He agreed readily, and then laughed in the kitchen at how little I had to organize, saying he could explain everything. The morning of the meeting, I felt like I was threading my way through old habits, writing notes in my small notebook, making coffee, testing the speaker so remote relatives could join. I felt the old knot of trust and the new weight of betrayal. When everyone sat down, I started by telling the story of how Jonah and I had always managed household tasks together and how we planned our future. I reminded the room of our shared history and the promises that had tied us. Then, without raising my voice, I laid out the timeline: transaction alerts with dates, calendar invites showing rescheduled payments, screenshots of messages where Jonah described me as incapable, and the copy of the cloud folder with the messages he had sent to relatives. I watched his face as the neat stack of paper grew. He tried to interrupt, to call the documents misleading, but my cousin held up her phone and read the exact text he had sent to her last winter, where he called me unstable and said he had been covering for me. My aunt, who had suggested he was stabilizing, put her hand over her mouth and said she had not known he would be rewriting the story. Jonah tried one final lie at the climax. He said one of the contractor payments had been a mistake on the bank's part, that the receipt had been fabricated, and that I was manufacturing evidence. The landlord stood up and said he had the contractor's checks showing direct deposits, and the dates matched my timeline. The room folded into a different quiet. I could see, in my mother's voice through the video link, the beginning of a question that would not be silenced. I presented the plan I had worked out with the attorney. We would audit the joint accounts, restore any funds wrongly moved where possible, and sign a mediated agreement that updated access to our finances and required joint sign-off for future transfers related to property work. I told Jonah that if he refused, we would separate our finances. I would inform the mortgage counselor, and I would pursue formal accounting review. I did not shout. I did not threaten. I offered a path that respected our shared history, but enforced boundaries as consequences. Jonah's expression shifted between anger and disbelief, and finally, when my aunt asked him to explain his messages, he stammered. He tried to play the confused husband, the man who had helped at the estate meeting, but the receipts did not fit his story. The next day, he left the house and slept at a friend's apartment. He texted long confessions and some apologies, some claims that he had done it to protect me from family stress, and other messages pleading for a chance. I did not text back for 24 hours. In that silence, my life changed. We signed the mediated agreement, separated our accounts, and he agreed to therapy and to restitution where possible. The family started to heal because the truth had shifted the allegiance back toward transparency. My sister called and apologized for doubting me. My aunt came by and brought over a tray of soup and asked how she could help with the house paperwork. The new normal was hard and careful, and I felt both lighter and more alone. Weeks later, there was a final twist that tightened the resolution. I found, tucked in an old cookbook my grandmother had given me, a handwritten note Jonah had left early in our marriage, a silly list of errands, and a doodle of the attic light. It had been a private joke between us, and I had always smiled when I found it. I assumed he had misplaced it, and I kept it among my own things. When I looked again, while packing papers for the accountant, I noticed a date in the margin that did not fit the time the note was written. It matched the date of a transaction he had claimed to be in error. The small, intimate object that once comforted me had quietly recorded one more detail of his timeline. I took a photograph of the margin date and added it to the file I had shown the family. It was a small poetic justice, the same intimacy that had tied us together, shared drawers. The habit of leaving notes in books had also held the proof of his contradictions. When I presented that final bit at a follow-up meeting, he stopped trying to explain. The mediated agreement became permanent, and I began to reclaim my future plan on my terms. I signed the lease for a studio in a neighborhood I loved, and the house purchase was paused so the family could proceed without the pressure he had put on everyone. Jonah and I remain separate now. He is part of my history and not my future. The relationship changed in a way that could not be undone. Boundaries were enforced, access to finances restructured, and family members who had been pulled into his stories now had the truth laid out in front of them. I lost the illusion of the home we promised, but I did not lose my place in my family or my dignity. I paint mornings now in a light-filled room I pay for with a ledger I keep myself. And when I mail a note to my aunt or call my sister, we speak plainly about what happened. I still have moments of grief for the person I thought Jonah was, and for the way trust can be weaponized. But the revenge I chose was not cruel. It was documentation, calm disclosure, and a reshaping of the new normal so the people who mattered could make informed choices. The betrayal was intimate because he used our intimacy to hide the truth, and the payoff was intimate too. The family learned the truth, boundaries were enforced, and I reclaimed both my reputation and my future. Sometimes, when the light in my studio hits a certain angle, I think about how trust accumulates the way dust does. You hardly notice it until a breeze, one word, one strange transaction catches it and reveals a whole forgotten surface. I used to think revenge would feel loud, a confrontation in the rain, a dramatic revelation that left everyone breathless. Instead, my revenge was quiet as ledger paper and patient as the stamps on letters. It was the steady work of naming what had been done to me and insisting the world see it. That insistence felt like reclaiming my brush after someone else had touched it too often. There are nights when I still rehearse the meeting in my head, what I did well, what I might have said differently, and mornings when I place a clean sheet of paper on the easel and feel braver. The dog snores at my feet. The radio plays a song we once loved, and I let the colors on the palette decide how bright today will be.